The kingdom I will focus on today is the kingdom Protista. This group is controversial because technically they're poorly defined. Imagine we have a word called non-spiders that includes rabbits and cars and clocks and, well, everything not a spider. It is hard to think of a good reason to talk about non-spiders. Protists are like that. They are eukaryotes that are not plants, animals, or fungi. So why did scientists come up with protists? And why are we talking about them today? Convenience. Though protists don't include all descendants of a common ancestor, they are the main reason the domain system was invented. They do share some things in common. Though diverse, most are multicellular, all have linear chromosomal DNA, all have membrane-bound organelles, and all are significantly larger than bacteria. And just to review, when I say organelles, I'm referring to things like mitochondria, the nucleus, and the endoplasmic reticulum. Put another way, eukaryotes have a lot more going on inside their cells than prokaryotes. Two of these organelles are very important. The chloroplast takes light from the sun and converts it into sugars. Without this process of photosynthesis, there probably would not be much life on Earth other than archaea. Plants, algae, which are a type of protist, and cyanobacteria all have chloroplasts in their cells. Mitochondria, which all eukaryotes have, convert those sugars into energy. They need oxygen to do this, which, by the way, is why we breathe. If you look closely at a mitochondrion, you will notice something interesting. They have their own DNA and ribosomes. What are those doing there? Scientists have a theory called endosymbiosis that explains where mitochondria and chloroplasts came from.
What if you could absorb another organism and take on its abilities? Imagine you swallowed a small bird and suddenly gained the ability to fly. Or if you engulfed a cobra and were then able to spit poisonous venom from your teeth. Throughout the history of life, specifically during the evolution of complex eukaryotic cells, things like this happened all the time. One organism absorbed another, and they united to become a new organism with the combined abilities of both. We think that around 2 billion years ago, the only living organisms on Earth were prokaryotes, single-celled organisms lacking membrane-bound organelles. Let's look closely at just 3 of them. One was a big, simple, blob-like cell with the ability to absorb things by wrapping its cell membrane around them. Another was a bacterial cell that converted solar energy into sugar molecules through photosynthesis. A third used oxygen gas to break down materials like sugar and release its energy into a form useful for life activities. The blob cells would occasionally absorb the little photosynthetic bacteria. These bacteria then lived inside the blob and divided like they always had, but their existence became linked. If you stumbled upon this living arrangement, you might just think that the whole thing was one organism, that the green photosynthetic bacteria were just a part of the blob that performed one of its life functions, just like your heart is a part of you that performs the function of pumping your blood. This process of cells living together is called endosymbiosis, one organism living inside another. But the endosymbiosis didn't stop there. What would happen if the other bacteria moved in too? Now the cells of this species started becoming highly complex. They were big and full of intricate structures that we call chloroplasts and mitochondria. These structures worked together to harness sunlight, make sugar, and break down that sugar using the oxygen that right around this time started to appear in the Earth's atmosphere. Organisms absorbing other organisms was one way species adapted to the changing environmental conditions of their surroundings. This little story highlights what biologists call the endosymbiotic theory, the current best explanation of how complex cells evolved. There's a lot of evidence that supports this theory, but let's look at 3 main pieces. First, the chloroplasts and mitochondria in our cells multiply the very same way as those ancient bacteria, which are still around, by the way. In fact, if you destroy these structures in a cell, no new ones will appear. The cell can't make them. They can only make more of themselves. Second piece of evidence. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both contain their own DNA and ribosomes. Their DNA has a circular structure that is strikingly similar to the DNA of the ancient bacteria, and it also contains many similar genes. The ribosomes, or protein assembly machines of chloroplasts and mitochondria, also have the same structure as ribosomes of ancient bacteria, but are different from the ribosomes hanging around the rest of the eukaryotic cell. Lastly, think about the membranes involved in the engulfing process. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both have two membranes surrounding them, an inner and outer membrane. Their inner membrane contains some particular lipids and proteins that are not present in the outer membrane. Why is that significant? Because their outer membrane used to belong to the blob cell. When they were engulfed in the endosymbiosis process, they got wrapped up in that membrane and kept their own as their inner one. Surely enough, those same lipids and proteins are found on the membranes of the ancient bacteria. Biologists now use this theory to explain the origin of the vast variety of eukaryotic organisms. Take the green algae that grow on the walls of swimming pools. A larger eukaryotic cell with spinning tail structures, or flagella, at some point absorbed algae like these to form what we now call euglena. Euglena can perform photosynthesis, break down sugar using oxygen, and swim around pond water. And as the theory would predict, the chloroplasts in these euglena have 3 membranes, since they had 2 before being engulfed. The absorbing process of endosymbiotic theory allowed organisms to combine powerful abilities to become better adapted to life on Earth. The results were species capable of much more than when they were separate organisms. And this was an evolutionary leap that led to the microorganisms, plants, and animals we observe on the planet today.
Protists are classified in 3 main groups. There are the close relatives of fungi called slime molds, the close relatives of animals called protozoans, and the close relative of plants called algae. I want to focus on protozoans and then algae. First, let's talk about the amoeba. This blob is common in ponds and it moves using extensions of its body known as pseudopodia or false feet. They push the cytoplasm from one part of their cell to another to move and to capture prey. This paramecium, another protist, has been caught by the amoeba and will soon be devoured. If an amoeba's pond dries up, it can form a cyst, which is a dried up version of itself that does not need food or water for extended periods of time. Cysts can also form inside living tissue. Some amoeba are parasites, and when we drink pond water, we run the risk of getting amoeba burrowing inside of our bodies. If we attack the amoeba, it can form a cyst that prevents us from harming it. The cyst also prevents amoeba from doing much harm to us. One species of amoeba, Entamoeba histolytica, causes a disease known as amoebic dysentery. Dysentery is bloody diarrhea, and more people died from it during the US Civil War than gunshots. There is also a species of amoeba that lives in hot springs. It gets into your body through your nose or mouth. It can find its way to your brain and be deadly. The main cause of diarrhea from drinking river or pond water is another protist called Giardia. The disease, giardiasis, is sometimes called beaver fever because beavers also get Giardia. Oddly enough, it turns out ponds with beavers have less Giardia because remember how beavers are keystone species? They create wetlands that are home to many other protists that outcompete Giardia. Waterfowl and carnivores like foxes tend to spread more Giardia than beavers do. The next pathogenic protist is one we will discuss later in class, so pay attention. Trypanosoma brucei causes sleeping sickness in the middle of the African continent. It is estimated that 300,000 people are infected every year when they get bitten by a tsetse fly carrying the protist. Infected people become narcoleptic, meaning that they fall asleep suddenly and can go into a coma. More importantly, it is deadly to cows and most domestic animals. This means that people in Africa have very little access to protein. Without protein, child mortality is high. Countries tend to go through stages of development known as the demographic industrial transition. where they switch from having high birth and death rates with agriculture-based societies to wealthier industrialized societies with low birth and death rates. Many African countries are unusual because they are stuck at the first stage of this transition. I want you to consider how disease associated with trypanosoma may be a key reason why. One of the most bizarre protozoan diseases is toxoplasmosis. 1 in 3 people have it. You get it by breathing in cat feces infected with Toxoplasma gondii. 20 to 30% of the world's cats have it, and they get it from eating infected mice. What makes this disease strange is that it causes subtle neurological changes. Mice with the disease lose their fear of cats, making them more likely to get eaten. People tend to be asymptomatic for decades, but later in life become tired, paranoid, irritable, and are 2.65 times more likely to have a car accident. They also start hoarding behavior, particularly things they love, like cats. Sound familiar? Perhaps grandma is more than just a crazy cat lady. She may have toxoplasmosis. Malaria is currently the second deadliest disease in the world behind tuberculosis. 300 to 500 million people are infected and 500,000 people die each year. The disease is tropical, located in countries near the equator. This is because mosquitoes that transmit the malaria parasite live in tropical environments. When a mosquito that carries the protist drinks blood, it injects saliva with it into its host. The protist metamorphosizes into different forms throughout its life cycle, targeting different organs. It will switch from the blood to the liver and back to the blood, where it can be picked up by a mosquito and go from the gut to the salivary glands. One unusual symptom is cyclical high fever followed by shivering. The disease may result in seizures and coma. People of African descent commonly have a genetic disorder known as sickle cell anemia, which causes the blood cells to have sickle shape. These cells are immune to infection by Plasmodium falciparum, the protist that causes malaria. There is a clear correlation between the occurrence of malaria and poverty rates. The two feed off one another because poor communities cannot afford treatment, cleanup of pooled water where the mosquitoes breed, or mosquito netting. While malaria reduces tourism, is a daily cost, and a burden for workers and students who are sick. DDT, a pesticide discovered in 1939, was commonly sprayed to kill mosquitoes until it was discovered to harm people and wildlife in the 1960s. The current best preventative measure is using mosquito nets while sleeping. Climate change is expected to increase flooding and therefore increase mosquito breeding and disease. The first treatment for malaria was discovered by Spanish missionaries in Peru in 1632. They found that natives chewed the bark of the fever tree to avoid malaria. The chemical responsible was quinine. It was isolated in 1820 and synthesized for the first time in 1912. The bitter taste caused Brits to mix it with gin. Thus, the gin and tonic was invented as a means of preventing malaria. Not all protists make us sick. Zooxanthellae are symbionts that live inside the bodies of coral animals. They are the little orange dots in the photo. In exchange for a home, they provide the coral polyp with sugars because they are photosynthetic. Another neat group of protists are the diatoms. There are 16,000 described species that live in tiny shells made of silica. A single liter of seawater can contain 10 million of these microbes. Because they're photosynthetic, they are a major source of oxygen in our atmosphere. Have you ever heard of a red tide? Sometimes the coastal water will turn blood red from a population explosion of red algae called dinoflagellates. They produce a toxin that is deadly to wildlife. Climate change is expected to cause more red tide events because dinoflagellates prefer warm water. Another alga in the genus Euglena has a neat extra feature. It has an eye spot, which is a pigmented organelle that tells the direction that light is coming from. Why might this be useful? I also want to point out that this is a very primitive eye. I mentioned that not all protists are unicellular. Seaweed is one example. Another is Volvox, which is a ball of colonial cells. This is cool because it shows how multicellularity evolved in plants.